All right. Hi, all. I hope everyone is doing well. So, this is the poster that I presented at NASP, and my capstone project looked at evaluating the psychometric properties of common ASD identification tools. So, I began by researching the history of autism identification in the schools, and a lot of studies confirmed the disproportionality that is present in ASD identification at the state level and across racial groups. Research concluded that economically vulnerable populations may only receive an educational identification of ASD due to these differences between systems. Therefore, culturally and linguistically diverse populations, this educational ASD identification may influence the treatment and interventions they receive. And we also know that research has shown that early identification and intervention mitigate ASD severity across lifespan. This, in turn, increases the need for an educational identification of ASD to be accurate and be completed with a CLD lens. Although the research on ASD identification in the schools and the need to appropriately evaluate students from racially and linguistically minoritized populations has been noted, research on the identification process of ASD has not been well studied. Understanding the impact that an education diagnosis of ASD can have for economically vulnerable populations confirms the need for research on identification tools used with these populations. The present study is guided by the two following research questions. What are the psychometric properties of the most common used tools in schools for ASD identification? And are these tools psychometrically rigorous for use with all populations, in particular those from racially and ethnically minoritized backgrounds? So the literature first focused on researching ASD identification in the schools. First, looking at what are the common practices and assessment tools that are utilized. And NASP practice model domain includes the importance of data-based decision-making when selecting an assessment tool and the use of evidence-based assessment practices in a recent position statement. However, a recent study also found that fewer than 25% of school psychs are using evidence-based assessment practices when assessing for ASD. And those who are using best practices reported higher levels of training in autism than those who did not. These findings indicate that many school psychologists have a lack of knowledge and training with assessment in students with ASD, highlighting the need for information of the psychometrics and standardization demographics of ASD tools. We then focused on disproportionality in ASD identification. Researchers believed that the disparity might be due to problems with the current assessment practices and processes. There is currently no research identifying which factor of the process is to blame, as researchers believe there are many factors that relate to this phenomenon within the assessment process. Research on the psychometric properties of the most common ASD measures within the schools is one piece of the puzzle that can be important to understand. We then looked at the discrepancies of ASD identifications in the school. For racially and ethnically diverse children and those from low SES families, schools may be the only place where ASD services are accessible for families. Lack of knowledge regarding the tools, psychometrics, have the potential to lead to under-identification, over-identification, or misidentification of certain populations. And thus, school psychologists working with children with ASD in the schools must receive the appropriate training and experiences to be able to serve the unique needs of diverse children with ASD and reduce identification disparities. The current study aims to evaluate the psychometric properties and assessment needs of diverse students with ASD and ultimately to inform practitioners and provide appropriate, accurate, and early assessment interpretations and recommendations for educational teams about tool selection and interpretation. So now looking at kind of how we did this. How did we do this systematic review of these ASD tools? We first started by creating a protocol for evaluating these assessments. What were we looking for? We looked at reliability, validity, and demographics of the standardization sample. We completed a literature review on other research that completed a systematic review on these areas. Our protocol for evaluating ASD assessments were based on two studies. One provides a systematic review of the psychometric properties of social network site engagement scales, and the other conducted a study to review which anxiety measures were most commonly used with older adults in residential aged care facilities to determine whether the psychometric data supported their use with this population. We compiled components from both of these studies to create our evaluation protocol for evaluating the psychometrics of these common ASD identification tools. Included within our protocol was validity and reliability, so many different kinds. We looked at content validity, structural validity, association with other variables, response processes, internal consistency, iterator, test, retest, split half, criterion validity, construct validity, and response and administrative burden. So now that we kind of had this protocol of how we were going to be reviewing these ASD identification tools, we needed to figure out what ASD identification tools we were going to look at. So we created an inclusion criteria to determine this. And we only used the validation of the tool that was provided through the publishers. And additionally, the measures coded needed to meet the following criteria. It had to be an ASD identification tool. It could not just be a screener. It had to have psychometric data, it had to be standardized, and it needed to be normed in the US. If it met these three criteria, we then further looked at the frequent use of the measure in schools. Is this measure used by school professionals, and is this something that is commonly used in the school community? So as you can see on this poster, the ASD assessments analyzed were the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised, the ADIR, the Autism Spectrum Rating Scale, the ASRS, the Childhood Autism Rating Scale, the CARS, the Checklist for Autism Spectrum Disorder, the Gilliam Autism Rating Scale, the GARS, and the Social Responsiveness Scale, the SRS-2, and the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, the ADOS-2. We looked at these 7 assessments, and then we also looked at each version or form type of each of these seven assessments. So the results. So as you can see on this poster, in the top right, the green indicates that the assessment included the psychometric, and the red means that it did not. And as you can see, several of the measures analyzed did not include multiple reliability and validity analysis for standardization. Most assessments included internal consistency except the ADAS, which did not include this measure for any of their modules. Most assessments also included test-retest information for standardization. As you can see, there was variability in assessments that reported information about inter-rater reliability, and split half, absolutely no assessment included information about split half reliability. Looking further at validity, most assessments included construct validity in their standardization. Only a select few included criterion validity, and most included structural validity. As you can see, this data highlights the discrepancies of psychometrics reported out within assessment versions and across all ASD-specific assessments reviewed. For example, there are differences in the types of validity that are reported out between the ASRS short versions and long versions, which we thought was very interesting to note. Then looking at the racial demographics, which you can see in Table 2 in the lower left-hand corner. This includes a standardization sample for each assessment and the percentage of each racial group that makes up the standardization sample. We focused on white, African American, and Latinx, as this made up a majority of the standardization sample. However, other races were also noted for some of these assessments. And as you can see from this table, the CARS 2 standard version had the largest African American representation in their standardization sample at 16.2%, while the ADOS had the smallest African American representation at 11%. The SRS-2 reported the largest Latinx representation at 16.6%, and the ADOS-2 reported the smallest presentation of Latinx at 4%. It's one important thing, an interesting thing to note, is the ADOS did not break down standardization by module in their assessment manual. They only reported it as a whole. And then it's interesting even more is that the ADIR, the CASD, and the CARS parent questionnaire do not even provide a racial breakdown in their manuals. So kind of in sum, many of the most used ASD assessment tools are not psychometrically adequate for culturally and linguistically diverse populations. Many of the tools have standardization sample of less than 16% for both Latinx and African American populations. And of the tools that have been analyzed, several do not include multiple reliability and validity verifications. So what does this mean for school psychologists? It means that school psychologists should provide disclaimers in their reports about the limitations of these tools. They should advocate for additional research and ASD identification tool development that is culturally and linguistically responsive. They should be cognizant that ASD tools are not required when conducting psychoeducational evaluations. And from the ecological perspective, family and community involvement are key in providing meaningful services for students with ASD from diverse communities. And the use of standardized scores with an ASD identification may be less appropriate for some racial groups than others, given the limited data provided in the standardization of these tools. It's important to always complete comprehensive interviews and histories, and necessary to observe the student multiple times to make an identification of ASD in the schools, and especially to do this from a CLD lens. Some of the limitations of this study were first, many of the assessments did not explicitly differentiate standardization breakdown across the modules. For example, the ADOS 2 did not discuss any psychometric data from Module 4, and the ASRS does not break down standardization by age range, only by parent and teacher, making it challenging to know the representation of individuals in each version. This review also only used data from the publishers of the assessments, and if these analyses had been conducted in other studies, they were not included in the Kirk study because they were not made publicly available. So we only stuck to the data that was provided in the assessment manuals. So kind of overall conclusions. The finding of the study suggests that school psychologists must interpret ASD identification tools with caution given the dearth of data available about their psychometric properties, and hence the assessment of ASD symptomatology. This lack of information can contribute to misidentification and delayed identification of ASD among some racial groups. School psychologists and other special education personnel must interpret ASD identification tools with caution given the limitation of these tools, as well as incorporate cultural and linguistic information into evaluation practices to improve potential disproportionality of ASD identification. And that is my capstone. Thank you.